took me a while to notice that something had changed. Ashley and I had been together for almost 10 years. She was my support, my best friend, and seemed to be the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Our life was simple but happy. We bought a house together in the suburbs of Chicago, got a dog, and regularly went to the lake on weekends. Everything seemed so perfect that I didn't even notice the cracks that started to appear over time. It started with little things. She started staying at work longer than usual. Then there were frequent meetings with colleagues. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. Ashley had always been a workaholic, and I was proud of her dedication to her job. But one night, when she came home late, I noticed something else, a new perfume, and it was definitely not the one she used to wear. I tried to brush these thoughts aside. People change perfumes, meetings can be long, and maybe I'm just imagining things. But my inner voice kept whispering that something was wrong. One day, when I came home from work early, I found her phone left on the kitchen table. I've always been someone who believed in privacy, but this time something pushed me to pick it up. I opened her messages and saw a name that didn't mean anything to me. Jack. Their correspondence was hidden under the guise of a joking correspondence about work. But between the lines I could read more than just friendship. I felt a cold sweat cover my skin. I decided not to make a scene right away. Instead, I started watching. No, I'm not proud of it, but I was desperate. I put a GPS on her car and one day decided to follow her. She said she was on her way to meet a client, but she parked outside a hotel in the city center. I watched her enter, and a few minutes later I saw a tall man in a suit join her. It was Jack. Couldn't breathe. My world literally collapsed around me. I didn't stop her that night. I went home and spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling. The next morning I acted as if nothing had happened. I needed more evidence, more insight into what was going on. The next week, I hired a private investigator. Seems extreme, but I wanted to know the truth. And the truth came quickly. The detective confirmed my suspicions. They had been seeing each other for several months. They went to restaurants, hotels, and even spent a few days together on a business trip. But here's where things got really weird. One evening I received an envelope in the mail. There was only one photo in it. Ashley and Jack in a restaurant. On the back, someone wrote, "She's playing a dangerous game." I was in a panic. Who sent this? What does it mean? I started digging deeper. I found out that Jack was not just a coworker. He was her boss. And not just a boss, but the head of a large corporation that had been involved in scandals recently. I also learned that he was married. His wife, Amanda, was a woman who was said to be capable of destroying anyone's career with a single call. I decided it was time to act. I met with Amanda. She was a brave, determined woman who, as it turned out, knew about her husband's infidelity but kept silent because it was beneficial for her to maintain the appearance of a perfect marriage. She was, however, ready to help me if it would harm Jack. We planned everything carefully. I arranged for Ashley and Jack to meet at the same hotel, but this time Amanda came with photographers. The scandal broke out immediately. Jack lost his job and his reputation was ruined. Ashley couldn't escape the consequences either. She lost everything, including our relationship. I thought that after that I would be able to find peace again. But a few weeks later, I received another envelope. Contained a photo of Amanda and me in a cafe. On the back was the words, "Now it's your turn." I realized that the whole thing was a trap. Amanda had been manipulating me from the very beginning, and now I was part of her game. I spent several sleepless nights looking at that photo. Who took it? How did they know about our meeting? And most importantly, what did "now it's your turn" mean? It wasn't just a coincidence. Someone wanted to involve me in something bigger than I could have imagined. The next day, I tried to contact Amanda. She answered right away, but her tone was completely different. "I thought you would realize that we are in this together," she said. Her voice was calm, but cold, as if she already knew I would have no choice but to continue playing the game. Together? In what exactly? My voice was tense. She explained that the photo was her warning. Her marriage to Jack wasn't just a formality, it was a struggle for control of his business. Now that his reputation was ruined, she was going to take over the company, and I was just a tool for her. Your move meant I had to help her. Why me? I'm just a man who was betrayed. Why did you drag me into this? She laughed. Do you think it was an accident? I knew about your suspicions even before you hired a detective. Everything that happened was part of my plan. Jack was playing with fire, and you were the one who helped me burn him. I felt cold. She was using me from the very beginning. All those photos, the threats, even her cooperation, it was all an act. But now she was demanding that I take the next step, testify against Jack to ensure her victory. And what happens if I refuse? I asked. You don't want to know, she replied before hanging up. I could not allow myself to be forced to become her puppet. But I also realized that refusing could have consequences I didn't even realize. I decided to play my game. I started collecting evidence. I went back to the detective and asked him to find out everything he could about Amanda. Her connections, her true motives, her weaknesses. In the meantime, I started acting as if I were ready to comply with her demands. I agreed to testify, but only after a personal meeting. At that meeting, Amanda looked victorious. She handed me the papers I had to sign and explained how everything would unfold. But it was at that moment that my detective sent me a message. He had found something that changed everything. Amanda had a dark past herself. It turned out that her interest in Jack's business was far from disinterested. She was involved in a scam that could have destroyed not only her reputation but also landed her in jail. This was exactly what I needed. I decided to act sharply. While we were sitting in her office, I turned on the recording. I began to gently hint at her past, asking questions that made her nervous. Finally, she broke down and started saying things she shouldn't have said. I wrote it all down. Now it's your turn, I said as I walked out of her office. Her face was pale. I handed the recording over to the police and journalists. Although it was risky, I realized that only the truth could free me from her manipulations. The scandal broke a few days later. Amanda was arrested for financial crimes, and her perfect life fell apart. But the story didn't end there. A month later, I received another envelope. There was only one word in it, "Well done," and no signature. I still don't know who sent it. Amanda? Someone else who was following the whole story? That remains a mystery. But now I know one thing. In a world where people play dangerous games, the best way to win is to play better than them. My life gradually returned to normal. After Amanda's arrest and the scandal that erupted around her and Jack, I decided that I needed a fresh start. I sold our house in the suburbs and moved to a small apartment closer to downtown Chicago. Working out, and occasionally seeing friends became my way of escaping the burden of the past. But the past rarely leaves us alone. One evening, when I returned home after a long day, I found a small black envelope in my apartment door. There was no address or sender's name on it. When I opened it, I saw only a small photo. My new house, taken from across the street. On the back was an inscription, "You don't know everything." It was again something strange and threatening. At first I thought it had something to do with Amanda. Perhaps one of her associates decided to deal with me because I was the reason she was in prison. But then I started to doubt it. Why did this happen only now when everything seemed to be over? I decided to find out. The next morning I went to the police and showed them the envelope. They took it seriously, took the photo for examination, and advised me to be careful. I also hired the same detective who helped me with Amanda. Together we began to analyze who could be behind the message. Days turned into weeks, but no new clues emerged. Meanwhile, I started noticing strange things. One day I found a cigarette butt in my apartment, even though I don't smoke. Another time, my mail looked like it had been opened and resealed. It was no longer just a coincidence. One evening I received another message. This time it was through email. The email had no subject line, and its text consisted of one sentence. "Do you think you are saved?" It was accompanied by a video. I recognized myself in it when I was leaving the police building a few days ago. Someone was following me. My detective finally found a clue. The person who was following me was a man named Michael Grayson. He was a private investigator, but he also had a suspicious connection to Jack's company. As it turned out, Michael had previously worked for Jack, and then for someone who considered himself his enemy. And now he seemed to be working to make me his next victim. I decided to meet with Michael. It was risky, but I needed to understand what he wanted. We arranged to meet at a cafe, and he didn't hesitate. The middle-aged man, dressed in a casual suit, seemed completely confident. "You made a lot of people feel uncomfortable," he said as he sat down at the table. "What does that mean?" "I did nothing but defend myself," I replied. "It's not as simple as you think. What you did to Jack and Amanda opened a door that would have been better left closed," he said. His voice was calm, but I could feel the threat in it. I insisted that he explain everything, and he began to tell me. It turned out that the whole story, Ashley's betrayal, her relationship with Jack, Amanda's manipulations, was just part of a bigger scheme. Jack's business, his corporation, was involved in illegal transactions, and my role in the scandal made this scheme collapse. Now those behind the scheme wanted to keep me silent. "My advice to you is to disappear," Michael said before getting up and leaving. I realized that the situation was getting dangerous, but I couldn't just run away. This game had dragged me in, but now I was going to finish it. I decided to contact the journalists using all the evidence I had. If these people wanted to silence me, I would make the truth even louder. I prepared a package of evidence and sent it to several major publications. I also left copies in a safe place with a letter. If anything happens to me, publish this. Although I didn't know if it would help, it gave me a sense of control. A few days later, the media began to investigate. The scheme involving Jack, Amanda, and their partners became public. The scandal was so big that federal authorities intervened. I knew it was only the beginning, but at least now the game had moved to another level. But one evening I received the last message. It was short, but frightening. You may have won the battle, but the war is not over yet. The message was cold and precise. It reminded me that even when it seems like you have won, the real end may be very different. I knew it was a warning, but now I had no turning back. I started to notice new faces around me. In the coffee shop, on the street, even in the gym. A man with dark glasses. A woman who tried to look busy with her phone, but kept looking in my direction. Could have been paranoia, but it seemed like they were always around. One day I decided to check if I was being followed. After walking for a few blocks and making a few unexpected turns, I noticed that the man in the dark jacket was not far behind. I turned into a deserted street, stopped, and turned around sharply. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked, trying to sound confident. The man stopped, smiling slightly. "Don't worry. I'm here to help," he said. "Help? Who sent you?" "Let's just say that there are people who want you to stay alive." His tone was calm, but there was a hint of something more in his words. He handed me a business card. There was only a name on it, Connor Reeves, and a phone number. "When you're ready to figure out what you're dealing with, give me a call," he said, and left. I decided to wait. On the one hand, it could be a trap, but on the other hand, maybe this Connor really knew something important. A few days later, when the tension was only growing, I called him. We met in a small bar on the outskirts of the city. Connor was confident, but not like a typical agent or operative. He looked like a man who had seen a lot and knew even more. "Listen, your situation is much more complicated than you realize. You've become a problem for some very dangerous people," he began. "Who are they?" I asked. "They are not just businessmen. It's a network. They are connected to the government, finance, even crime. Jack and Amanda were just small pieces in their game. And now you're in their way," Connor said. His words were like a cold shower. This is no longer just a betrayal, intrigue, or scandal. I was in the center of a conspiracy that was far bigger than I could have ever imagined. "What can I do? How can I get out of this?" I asked. "There are two options," Connor said. "The first is to disappear. Forget your name, your life, and start from scratch somewhere far away. The second is to keep fighting, but know that it can end very badly." I couldn't just run away. Everything that happened was wrong, and I felt I had to see it through. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. Connor offered to help. He had people who could protect me and help me gather more evidence against this network. We started working together, but every step became more dangerous. I received new threats. One day I came home and saw that the door was broken. Everything was still in its place inside, but there was a knife with a note on the kitchen table. "One step wrong and you're next." My confidence was shaken, but Connor assured me that we were close to a solution. We found a way to access classified documents that could have exposed the entire network. It was a big operation, and I knew it was our last chance. But just when we were on the verge of success, everything went wrong. One evening, Connor called me. His voice was tense. "We've been exposed. They know who we are and what we're doing. You need to disappear right now," he said. I packed my things and went to the safe house we had prepared in advance. But when I got there, I realized I was trapped. When I entered the building, the door closed behind me, and the room was dark. "Did you think you could play with us?" A voice came from the speakers. "Now the game is over. For you." The light blinded me, and I saw several men slowly approaching. They had guns and cold stares. I gathered my thoughts. This could be the end, but I was not going to give up. I tried to stay calm, although my heart was pounding like crazy. The men were getting closer, and there was not a drop of hesitation in their eyes. But as I stood in the middle of the room, I realized that this was not just a massacre. They wanted something from me. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. One of the men, a tall man with a scar across his left eyebrow, stopped in front of me. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and showed me a photo of me and Connor at the bar. "He betrayed you," the man said. His voice was quiet but full of contempt. "What?" Couldn't believe my ears. "Connor is our guy. He played two sides. He brought you here so we could finish the game. But in reality, he's the one who did everything to ruin your life. His goal is to eliminate you as an inconvenient witness and then get away with it," the man explained. My head was spinning. It was like a scene from a bad movie. Connor, the man I trusted with my life? Another betrayal. Then why are you still living with me? If he's working for you, why am I still here? I blurted out. The man just smiled. "You can be useful to us. There is one last step in our game. We will give you a chance to prove your loyalty. Either you work with us, or it ends here and now." It was a choice without a choice. I felt like I was being squeezed in a vice and realized that my every action would have consequences. I agreed to play by their rules, although I had one thing in mind: to find a way to get out. They gave me one mission. I had to hand over certain documents that could put an end to the investigation that had already been launched by law enforcement. The documents were so dangerous that if they were published, not only me, but many other people would be at risk. I agreed to fulfill their order, but I had another plan. Before I met with the recipient of the documents, I contacted the journalist who was working on the story. We arranged to meet in a secret place, where I handed him the copies. When I returned to my friends, they did not suspect anything. A few days later, the documents became public. The scandal erupted with renewed vigor. The people behind it were exposed, and their schemes were destroyed. But this was only part of my victory. Connor, having learned that he had been betrayed, was himself under attack. He tried to escape but was caught. As it turned out, he was a double agent and played against everyone. Against me, against his employers, even against the police. I finally got a chance to disappear. The police offered me a witness protection program. I changed my name, moved to another state, and started a new life. But even after several years, I sometimes feel a cold stare behind me. Is it just paranoia? Or is someone from my past still watching me? One thing I've learned is that in a world ruled by intrigue and betrayal, trust can be your weakest point. My new life was quiet and simple. I settled in a small town somewhere in the Southwest, where no one asked too many questions. I worked in a local repair shop, helping people repair old cars and trying not to draw attention to myself. Everyone knew me as Tom Grayson, a regular guy who liked his job and avoided talking too much. But even in the deepest silence, the past finds a way to remind you of itself. One day, during another hot day, a strange woman came into the workshop. She looked tired from the road. Her car was covered in dust, and the hood was smoking. "Can you see what's wrong with this?" she asked, pointing to her old pickup truck. I'm used to customers, but there was something about her that made me wary. Her eyes seemed too attentive and her smile was forced. But I didn't let on. "Sure. Leave the keys and I'll take care of it," I replied, taking her order. She left the car and walked out. But through the window of the workshop, I noticed her standing nearby, as if waiting for something. I continued to work, but my thoughts were occupied only by her. Who was she, and why did her behavior seem so strange? In the evening, when the workshop was closing, I decided to take a closer look at her car. Normally, it would have been just an overheated engine or a faulty radiator. But this time I found something that made me feel cold. Under the hood, in a hiding place near the battery, was a small device that looked like a beacon. Someone had used her car for tracking. Or maybe she had brought it here on purpose. I turned off the tracker and put it in my pocket. The next morning, the woman returned. Her demeanor was a little nervous, but she tried to look at ease. "How is my car?" she asked. "Everything is fine, the engine is just overheating. You can take it," I said, handing her the keys. She thanked me, but before she got behind the wheel, she looked at me as if she was checking something. I watched her drive away and felt that this was just the beginning. A few days later, my suspicions were confirmed. I returned home and found the door ajar. Everything inside was upside down. Although I knew there was nothing important here, all the documents and records were in the past. This incident showed that they had found me. The next morning I received a letter in my mailbox. There was only one phrase in it. "We are always here for you." I realized that the game was on again. I contacted an old friend from the Witness Protection Program. He confirmed the worst. My new name had been leaked. It seems that someone from the past had sold this information. Most likely, it was part of the same network I was trying to expose. They did not forgive me for what I did. I had to pull myself together again and act. But this time I decided that I would not be a victim anymore. I started my own investigation. Using the tracker I found in that woman's car, I tried to track down who was behind it. This led me to a company that was connected to one of Jack's partners. I started following this company, collecting evidence. My life turned into a game of hide and seek, where every day could be the last. I didn't trust anyone anymore. Every time a stranger approached me, I asked myself, is it them? Or is it just a coincidence? The culmination came when I found out that the woman who had left the tracker in her car was working for them. But as it turned out, she also wanted to break out of this network. She found me because she thought I could help. We started working together. Together, we collected evidence and found a way to pass it on to law enforcement. But it cost us a lot. They persecuted us, tried to eliminate us, but we persevered to the end. When it was over and the network was finally destroyed, I disappeared again. Now I was living under a different name, in a completely different part of the country. I knew that this story would forever stay with me, but I also knew that I could cope. My past had taught me something important. Sometimes, to win this game, you have to become someone who cannot be found. My new life, though peaceful, felt like a prison. Every day was like the previous one. Every stranger seemed like a potential threat. I changed my name, my appearance, even my accent, but I couldn't change the main thing, the burden I was carrying. I felt that this was not the end. One day, while working on a ranch in Montana, where I had settled after everything that had happened, I received a letter. It was in my mailbox among the bills and advertising brochures. The sender was not indicated. There was only one photo inside. The photo was of me, and it was taken just recently here in Montana. My heart froze. I thought I had finally disappeared. I thought they had lost interest. But this photo was direct proof that someone had been following me. I spent the next few days in constant fear. I kept a close eye on everyone who came near the ranch. But nothing happened. No calls, no new letters. Just this photo and silent waiting. A week later, I received a new signal. This time it was a box left by the door. Inside I found a watch that had once belonged to Jack. It had somehow been kept all these years, and now it was back in my life again. Under the watch was a note. Remember how it all started? We're still here. It was a trap. Too obvious, too open a gesture. But I was already trapped in my fear and loneliness. So I decided to act. I couldn't run anymore. I'm sorry I changed my name. Let's fix it. I went back to the same place, the place where it all started. I knew it was dangerous. I knew the risk was huge, but I couldn't stop. All these years I had been living in constant fear, in the shadow of the past. I had to find out who was behind these shadows, who had decided to come back into my life again. I walked through familiar places, through the street where I used to live, through the park where Ashley and I used to spend a lot of time. But nothing had changed. The city seemed the same even though I knew it wasn't. Its inhabitants were people who had survived their own tragedies, and I was part of that history. And when I got to the cafe, I saw her again. Amanda. She was sitting at a table drinking coffee, and she looked the same as before. She looked calm, but her eyes, they were different, and so was her smile. She saw me and smiled, as she always did, as if time had stopped for her, but not for me. "Tom?" she said, and there was no anxiety in her voice. It was a voice I remembered, a shadow of her own, just as it had been when we were together. I sat down next to her, feeling how hard it was to breathe in this room. I searched her eyes for some answer to the question that had tormented me for years. "Do you know why I'm here?" I asked. Amanda smiled again. Her smile was soft, but there was irony in it.
Ido, Tom.
"And you know why you're here. It's all part of your game, and probably your mistake." "You mean it was my mistake? You were a part of this destiny for a long time." With a noise and a slight crackle, the door closed behind me, and I found myself in a new space. Now I was in a different place, in a different part of this huge building. All of these rooms seemed the same dead end, equally cold and soulless. I tried to understand what was going on, but the more I looked for answers, the more it seemed like they wouldn't come. But the worst part was that I couldn't shake the feeling that Amanda was here, among all these people and these situations. She was everywhere, even when she wasn't. And even when I couldn't see her, I could feel her shadow hanging in the air. I stood in the center of the room and wondered why all this was happening. And then, when I was ready to surrender to my fate, something changed. The bell rang, quiet but distinct, breaking this emotional vacuum. The door in front of me opened sharply, and Amanda was standing in the doorway. But she was different. She was no longer the woman I knew. There was no triumph or pain in her eyes. There was emptiness. She looked at me and then said quietly, "Have you finally realized what happened?" I stood there looking at her, but I felt nothing but emptiness. She was in front of me, but there seemed to be an endless space between us. All these months, these games, these betrayals, I couldn't understand what was really going on. And her question seemed so simple, so mundane. But at the same time, it was absolutely incredible. "Have you finally realized what happened?" she repeated. This time her voice sounded a little worse, somehow tired, as if there was no point in this game anymore. I realized she was waiting for an answer, but I couldn't find the words. There was only one thing going through my head. Why? Why am I still here? Why did you do this? Do you understand? I could barely say it. To be honest, I don't know if I can say that I understand anything. But I know one thing, I am not the same person I was. And you're not who you used to be. Amanda did not answer. She stood silent, and only the shadows on her face changed as she looked at me. Her gaze seemed to carry some old secrets that I could never understand. "Do you realize that everything that happened was necessary?" she asked again, her voice now as indifferent as her gaze. "All these games, all these plans, they were part of something bigger. We can't go back." I looked at her, but I no longer felt anything. This was the moment when I realized that all my attempts to find a way out, to regain control, were in vain. She wasn't an enemy. She wasn't a friend. She was part of this machine, part of this endless cycle. And I became a part of it as well. "You still don't get it, do you?" Amanda took a step forward, her face getting closer. "You thought it was all about you, about your choice. But you never had a choice. It was all part of the plan. Our plan." I felt everything in me shake. All my attempts, all my questions and doubts suddenly became nothing. I was not who I thought I was. I had no control over my life, even if that was the only thing I really wanted. "You couldn't have chosen differently, because everything was already decided." Her words sounded like a sentence. They did not bring any relief, did nothing to make me understand why all this was happening. I wanted to ask her why she did it, why we became part of this game. But instead, I just watched in silence as she stepped back, and there was nothing human in her eyes. It was as if everything that was happening had nothing to do with us as individuals, but was just part of a big chess game. "It's over," she said for the last time, and I felt everything in my heart freeze. She was right. Nothing I had experienced mattered. Nothing that had happened mattered. I took a step back, and then Amanda made one last move. She raised her hand, and a small, inconspicuous key appeared in her fingers. She said nothing more, only a look cold and ruthless, and I realized I was just a piece on the board, and this game had been decided long ago. The key in her hand was like a symbol of the final decision. It was so small and insignificant, but at the same time it was the key to everything I had lost and could never get back. I looked at it, but I couldn't imagine what it really meant. Maybe it was the key to freedom, or maybe it was another trap I would never be able to get out of. Amanda remained silent. Her gaze never left my eyes, but there was no more warmth or fear in it. She was calm, even indifferent to everything that was happening, as if she no longer felt any emotional connection to me or to what we once had. The silence between us was deafening. I tried to say something, but I couldn't find the words. I realized that there was no point in asking anymore. I was no longer important to her. I was just a part of her game, and now that she had won, I had no right to ask any questions. "You're not going back," she said, and it was more of a statement of fact than a question. "Do you understand that?" I just nodded. What else was there to say? My past had fallen apart, and I couldn't put it back together. She was right, I wasn't going back. All I could do now was move forward. But where? I had no idea. Amanda turned to the door and stopped quietly, as if she was thinking for a moment. "The choice was not yours," she said, her voice calm and cold. "But it doesn't matter anymore." And she walked out. I was left alone in that room, with my eyes still on the small key I now held in my hands. What did it mean? And why had it suddenly become so important? I felt something inside me begin to collapse completely. It was not pain, not disappointment. It was just an emptiness that began to fill me. I no longer had any direction or purpose. I was powerless, and although I felt like this game was over, there was no sense of relief. It was all just a bad dream that I would never wake up from. I felt my mind involuntarily disconnecting from this world. I was no longer a participant in this game. I was its victim. Silence reigned again. I looked around, but there was nothing else to focus on. Only the walls, only the door, only the key I was holding in my hands. But none of these objects made sense. I just stood there and waited. Waiting for what? I didn't know. But I guess all that was left was to wait for the next part of this story. The part that I no longer controlled. Time stopped. All the sounds of the world, all the thoughts, all the emotions that still remained in me merged into one incredibly loud silent hum. My hand was still holding the key. I wasn't even sure if it was my hand, or someone else's hand, or just a part of me that I no longer recognized. What now? Was there something that could change my future? I couldn't understand what had happened. If I had been able to do more, I would probably have gathered all the pieces of my memories, reconstructed the situation, and said something that could have changed my fate. But I couldn't. I was empty. My mind was torn apart, and in each part there was only one thought. I was no longer in control of my life. My consciousness was like a maze with no way out. I started to walk, not knowing where I was going, but my steps led me to the same corridor. The same place that seemed endless to me no longer looked so scary. It became familiar, not even noticeable. I was moving, but I didn't know what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just existing. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized that it was no longer just a betrayal. It was a manipulation, a game that lasted much longer than I could have imagined. I was just a part of this wheel that never stopped. Every movement, every look, every gesture. It was all part of some bigger plan in which I had no place. And then, when I had given up, when everything I did was automatic, I heard a voice. This time it was not Amanda's voice, but someone else's. A stranger, but familiar. I was overcome with the feeling that I was not alone again, that I was trapped again. But this time the trap was not physical, but emotional. I heard someone approaching. My hand automatically clenched the key. Either I was ready for it, or I just wanted to be prepared for something that would surprise me. The door opened, and there he stood. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice cold as ice. But there was something in it that made me listen. He didn't look like an enemy, he didn't look like a friend. He looked like another part of the game, a part one couldn't control. I looked at him, at his gaze, and I felt every step bringing me closer to the finish line of this story. And at that moment I realized, I will never leave this game. This labyrinth, these walls, these people, all of it was just a deception. And I was deceived. "Are you ready?" he repeated. And I answered, even though I didn't understand what it meant for me. "Yes," I whispered. And in that very moment, everything changed. It seemed like time had stopped. I stood in this room, realizing that there was no way out, that I had long been part of this game, part of this incredible manipulation that was pulling me to the very end. And all I could do was accept what awaited me. The man in front of me, his eyes cold and ruthless, took a step forward. I felt anxiety start to fill my body, but I still didn't have the strength to run away. I didn't know why, but this hopelessness, this fear that seemed to have become a part of me, felt more real than ever. "Did you really think you could stop all of this?" His voice was calm, as if he knew the answer for sure. "You've always been just a part of this mechanism. We are all just links in the chain." I didn't answer, although thousands of questions were boiling inside me. How did I end up here? Who is he? And most importantly, why am I still here? It was a struggle without victory. Nothing could be changed. The man took another step. I could feel my pulse speeding up, my heart starting to beat with more intensity. And at that moment I realized that this whole situation was no longer just a game. It was a sentence I had signed for myself when I made that decision. "You can't get out," he said again, coming closer. And I felt the weight of that statement pressing down on me. "You gave up a long time ago. You've always been a part of this, even when you thought you were choosing otherwise." And then everything became clearer than ever before. All these years, all these relationships, all these illusions, I was just part of a plan that had been determined long ago. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was something deeper. Something that could not be understood until you were in the very center of this game. I looked at my husband, and in his eyes I saw what I had felt all along. No one is interested in your struggle, your suffering. You are just a link in the chain that can be replaced whenever it is necessary. You don't realize that this was all set up from the beginning, he continued, his voice softer but no less harsh. You were just part of a bigger game. You still don't understand, but it doesn't matter. And then I heard her voice. Again. Amanda's. He's right, she said, coming into the room. You can't take it back. And there's no point in trying. She walked over to me, and I felt my heart clench. I had been waiting for this moment, but it was worse than I could have imagined. Everything I had been through was meaningless. All my attempts, all my hopes, I was just a part of something big that I couldn't change. Amanda looked at me with an expression of complete indifference, and that was the worst blow. She was no longer the person I knew. She was part of this game. She was its agent. I'm sorry, but your time is up, she said, and I felt everything inside me freeze. Then, when I stood in front of them, when I realized that there was no more possibility of escape, all that was left was one step forward. A step that had no return. It was not a step towards freedom. It was a step to the end. We are ending it now, the man said. And at that moment I realized I had been dead for a long time. Only now I realized it. My eyes lost focus when I took that step forward. Everything around me started to blur, and time slowed down, like in a bad dream. I tried to gather my thoughts, but they were scattered like an hourglass with no more time. My hands held this small key, but it no longer mattered. Neither the door nor freedom seemed so far away that I could no longer reach it. I turned to Amanda. She stood there like an irreversible fact, like a part of the very machine that broke me, and now she stood there watching me dissolve into this game. You won't change anything. Her voice was calm, but it had this cold undertone that I could already feel on me. I didn't answer. Couldn't. There was an emptiness in my head that was filling more and more space. I looked at her face, at her eyes, and then, as I tried to figure out what I was feeling, I realized one thing. Everything that happened between us was fake. We were parts of someone else's game, and we never had any control. Everything I thought I had experienced, everything I felt was just a reflection of that game. I had long been part of something bigger than I could understand. I thought I knew what I was doing. I whispered, but the words seemed foreign, even to me. They had no meaning. Amanda didn't answer. She just took a step back, and I realized that maybe this was her last role. She was no longer the woman I once loved. She was just another link in the chain that I could no longer change. And in that moment I realized that the real betrayal was not what she had done, but that I was willing to not see it. The man standing next to me quietly glanced at me. His eyes were not angry. They were just empty. This was the reality I was forced to face. "It's over," he said, and his words became heavy, like a burden that I finally understood. I felt something inside me suddenly change. It was not a relief, but I felt that everything in my life suddenly became clear. I stopped looking for answers because now I knew. This was not a game, this was reality, and I became a part of it. We all became part of this mechanism that gave us no choice. And then I turned around, not knowing where I was going, but I felt that I was no longer looking for anything. All my questions were behind me, like shadows in the dark. I was no longer the person I used to be. I no longer had any hope or despair. I just kept walking, and the more I walked, the clearer it became. It wasn't a betrayal. It was just part of a great and inevitable truth, and I could not change it. Step by step, I disappeared into the darkness, and the world that once seemed so real turned into a haze. But I was no longer afraid. This was my story, and it was coming to an end. I kept walking, not looking back, not looking for a way out, because I realized there was no way out. All that remained was to accept this step into the void. My shadow was following me, but I no longer tried to stop it. Step by step, I was sinking into darkness, and every move I made took me further away from what was once important, from what I called my life. All my memories now seemed alien, like photos on old postcards that no longer have any meaning. They existed, but I couldn't understand them anymore, just like I couldn't understand myself. I was a part of this endless game where my existence didn't matter. And the more I walked, the more I realized that everything was fake. Everything I had experienced was just a burning illusion that was already fading away. I stopped for a moment when I felt something was changing. I was standing in front of a huge shadow that was swallowing me up. It was the same place, the same feeling. I was no longer outside. I was inside this game. I became a part of it, and there was no way to get out. But I didn't need to choose anymore. It was not a matter of freedom. It was a matter of finally accepting my role. I looked forward again. All these years, all these struggles, all these mistakes, now it was just an echo. I no longer had the strength to change anything. And this became my world, a world where betrayal was simply part of the game. Step by step, I was sinking into darkness, and at one point I realized that I had nothing left to lose, because I was no longer who I was. I was part of this big game that was over, and I accepted it. The darkness swallowed me whole, and from that moment on, there was no more time or space for questions. I was not lost. I was just part of what I had become.